All right, In Pursuit of Dorothy, disc number 3.
At this point in our audiobook, we'll enter the world of conjecture that I mentioned earlier. Beyond the last second that John White viewed the Outer Banks on August 27, 1587, as it slipped over the horizon from his viewpoint on the departing flyboat. No one really knows what happened to the colonists beyond this point in time, but the discovery of a derelict two-masted ship on the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp in the mid-1800s, by children no less, is just too tantalizing to disregard. On a personal note, I only hope that I too am not just adding another chapter that will further confuse an already much confused mystery. But I've worked the puzzle over and over on a daily basis since September 6, 1996, when the realization that the two ships, Dorothie the Penance and the schooner the Dismal Swamp, could be the same. We'll start 1 minute after John White departs from the colonist. I'll take you into the Albemarle Sound, the Chowan River, the headwaters of Bennett's Creek. We'll review the unsuccessful search for the colonists by the Jamestown colonists in 1607. I'll do this for you from a logical standpoint using facts derived from the narratives and the on-the-spot observations. As I record, I'm located on a high bluff overlooking the Chowan River, halfway between the Eden House Bridge and Holiday Island. We must now consider the condition of the colonists on Roanoke Island. Apparently, they've been left with one Penance, Dorothie, and 4 ship's boats, 2 boats from the Lion and 2 boats from the Flyboat. Over the next few days, the colonists will organize their living quarters and prepare a probe to go into the main to that foretold 50-mile mark. They'll most likely increase their fortification to protect themselves from the infuriated Indians that are just a short distance away at Man's Harbor. Also, they'll be preparing for an approaching storm, probably another hurricane, following on the heels of the August 21st storm that set back John White's departure by 6 days. This can be assumed because John White wrote in his narrative the flyboat encountered a ferocious storm at sea about 16 days after his departure from Roanoke Island on August 27th. There's no way to tell at this time how much damage was done by this particular hurricane at Roanoke, but once again we can assume it wasn't pleasant for the colonists and probably disrupted the plans for launching their probe into the interior. Now we must consider what the colonists knew or could have known. Remember, the last contact the colonists had with the white man was August 27th, 1587. First off, we must consider the maps. In relationship to the 1587 colony and the Chowan River and other bodies of water in northeastern North Carolina, I've spent the last years of my life looking at maps produced by various cartographers. I've analyzed the difference between what is factual and what is not. It all comes down, or you might say, back to the John White Virginia Pars map of 1585. This is the map that I believe in, and all my research goes back to this map over and over again. You just can't get away from it. It is the only map that can be considered. If you stop to think about the construction of this map and what it shows, you can see that it's very straightforward with a lot of truths that cannot be denied. The Virginia Pars 1585 map was made from the observations of John White and Thomas Harriot, as it was their assigned duty to make measurements in 1585 during the Lane expedition, and to draw maps of Roanoke Island and their explorations. Thomas Harriot, a navigational mathematical genius in his own right, teamed up with John White, the artist, obviously brought out the best in both men. Harriot wanting to learn all he could about the new land, and an opportunity to experiment with his many navigational theories. while White had the ability to interpret what Harriet was telling him and the ability to put it on paper. Anyone today can look at Virginia Pars and see that it is so close to today's maps and even satellite photographs that it's uncanny. This map was constructed over 400 years ago and today is in the British Museum in London. The Virginia Pars 1585 In Pursuit of Dorothie is the only map that will do us any good. Drifting beyond the observations of this map to any other map and you're lost. My reason behind this statement is as follows. In most books and internet sites that I have observed, your attention will be called to Theodore de Bry and his beautiful, well-constructed wood prints of maps of the Roanoke Island area, as well as the Native American prints. We've mentioned this before. Well and good. I cannot deny the man was an artist at his trade, but Theodore de Bry did not publish his first map of the area until 1590. To make it simple and to the point, follow this short timeline here. John White and Thomas Harriot observe, measure the area, and draw Virginia Pars in 1585. Second, the 1587 colony is last seen in 1587 by Englishmen. 3. Theodore de Bry first publishes his maps in 1590. Obviously, the 1587 colonists had no knowledge of the de Bry maps. Again, obviously, the colonists did have knowledge of the Virginia Pars, or you might say could have knowledge, logically speaking. Two reasons come forth for this statement. First, being the dates are right, and second, John White was governor of the ill-fated 1587 colony. Now keep in mind there was much warlike maneuvering going on between Spain and England at the same time. I feel sure that Queen Elizabeth and company did everything in their power to prevent this map, the 1585 Virginia Pars, from falling into the hands of a Spanish spy and making its way to Spain. Possibly the map was not of general knowledge to the 1587 colonists, but obviously the knowledge was possessed by John White. And obviously, again, I feel sure that John White would have at least sketched the general area in the sand on the beach at Roanoke Island. This was his colony, his responsibility. His head was on the line. John White was very reluctant about leaving Roanoke Island in August of 1587, and even in a rush, he made preparations for the storage of his paintings and other materials. In no way did he just simply climb aboard a boat and sail away. He must have thought long and hard about departing the area, as indicated by the letter that he carried with him, signed by the colonists, relieving him of his duties on Roanoke, plus leaving his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchild. It is also a historical fact, as related by John White in his report, the colonists planned to move 50 miles inland. Many times I've seen researchers take a map of this area and search for this magic 50-mile mark. Well and good. You'll come up with several locations that are possibilities. Some researchers have examined this area on the maps that expires at 50 miles inland. They found nothing but more statements from the local folks about how they were descended from the colonists. By John White's statements, we're led to believe this would be a destination for the 1587 colony. And it also raises two questions. Why did John White want to search Roanoke Island on his return in 1590? He knew that they were planning to move 50 miles inland. Second, how were the colonists planning to travel there? What type of vehicle? As indicated by John White's statement, he wanted to search Roanoke Island for any remnants of his 1587 colony. He also knew the location of his buried stores, which he came upon dug up and spoiled by the rain. He also spotted the message left for him, CRO, on a tree, and the word Croatoan left on the door facing of the fort. However, there was no indication of any distress by the colonists due to the lack of the pre-planned Maltese cross that was supposed to be displayed if they left under pressure. Though confusing, I'm sure. Remember, almost 3 years to the day had passed since John White had set foot on Roanoke Island. And of course, a lot of things could happen over a 3-year period. Many historians have been perplexed about the Croatoan sign left on the fort, saying this is where they went. Croatoan, now in the vicinity of Buxton on the Outer Banks. Another historian says it was left to mislead any Spanish searchers who were looking for the colony to destroy it rather than rescue. For this historian, I see the possibility that the colonists were informed that this would be the process for departure. However, I feel that only the assistants or other trusted members of the colony were given the full knowledge of using the Maltese cross as an indication of distress. This also creates other possibilities, kind of like opening a can of worms. Consider the following. A few stragglers missed the boat, and this was their indication as to where they were going. Though they may have been stressed, they had no knowledge of the Maltese cross. Someone was trying to write Choanook, and it looked like or was assumed by John White to say Croatoan. Well, how well can you write on a tree in 1587 anyway? We really have no hard evidence, only John White's report on what he saw. Unfortunately for the world of scholars and historians, this Croatoan sign really poses a problem. It seems that this is one of the few instances where the colonists actually followed through on something that was pre-planned. What I really have a problem with is someone, say, under an Indian attack, taking time, or for that matter, having time to carve out such a signal. It just seems logical that if you were near the fort on Roanoke Island, under attack, and you did have enough wits about you, plus a handy tool with which to carve, and you actually could spell Croatoan 400 years ago, you might do so. But under the extreme pressure of an attack, you might just want to get the location across, and the heck with the Maltese cross bit. Even today, I've seen people, educated people, who cannot even say Croatoan, let alone spell it on a tree in a hurry. In another scenario of this scene, say one person had the assigned duty to leave such a carving, plus the person had the ability, the tools, and the skills that it would take to do it quickly, sort of the messenger or the communications officer. That's entirely possible and gives us another possible clue. The colonists were definitely not under attack when they departed Roanoke Island. What human being in his right mind would be standing outside the fort, facing the fort with his back to the enemy while they were under attack? So therefore no need for the Maltese cross. I feel that it would have taken several communications officers to get the job done if they were under attack, possibly one for each letter, as the predecessor would find himself rather busy plucking arrows from his backside. Sorry about that last paragraph, but I did promise you nitpicking on the entire subject, with an abundant outpouring of human logic. Probably while Croatoan was being engraved into the tree, Dorothie, the Penance, was moored nearby at the point of the creek, quoting John White as to where they kept her, being loaded for its departure. The colonists had made a final decision as to where they were going, Croatoan. It was indicated on the doorpost of the fort when John White returned in 1590. Is there anything else to believe? John White also indicated through Richard Hakluyt that the colonists were prepared to remove themselves 50 miles into the mainland. Obviously, Croatoan is not 50 miles into the mainland, but southeast of Roanoke Island, near present-day Buxton on Hatteras Island. Let's assume that the ship was launched with 3 ship's boats, all acting in consort. They make their way from Roanoke Island and head south to Croatoan. As always, they make their way slowly with the 3 ship's boats in the lead, and they're also rigged for sail. Let's just say that all 4 vessels arrive safely at Croatoan. The people go ashore and trek their way to the village. On arrival, they're met by Mandio's people. At Croatoan, it becomes obvious that the small island community cannot support such an influx of people to feed and house. As you remember, in the 1990s, Dr. David Phelps of East Carolina University did some digging in the Buxton area on Hatteras Island, trying to uncover evidence of the lost 1587 colony. Now, sure enough, evidence of Native American occupation turned up, along with evidence of European visitation. A signet ring was discovered belonging to a member of the Kendall family, according to Phelps. However, the ring could have belonged to a master Master Kendall registered with the Lane colony of 1585 and had no relation to John White's lost 1587 colony, as its owner was returned safely to England by Drake's fleet in 1586. Now, because of this story, conclusions started jumping once again, with people of the general population concluding this is where they went. The ring proves nothing in relation to the 1587 colony, and as a result of the chronology involved, once again we have no hard evidence as to the whereabouts of the 1587 colony, or no proof that the 1587 colonists went to Croatoan. If the colonists of 1587 did actually engrave the tree and post and did actually go to Croatoan, then the archaeologists sifting through the strata there at Buxton cannot help prove the existence of the colony until they find at least one piece of hard evidence buried in the soil there. This historian believes that they never will, because the 1587 colony, in whole or in part, most likely did not go there. The colonists of 1587 were already under enough stress, and it is very illogical to think that they would sail themselves into more. They had few supplies. Chesapeake Bay was in the opposite direction. Winter would be bearing down soon, and the most damning thought of all, they needed to be where they would be resupplied. That was the whole idea. John White's return to England, to be resupplied. In this day and age, when you leave a message on your voicemail for a certain party and realize you have to change the plans at the last minute, it very easily can be corrected and the proper plans posted. Of course, in 1587, to change a plan in midstream, no pun intended, was almost impossible. I really like historian Tom Paramore's suggestion that Croatoan was simply put on the door facing to direct White and others that the Croatoan Indians had the information needed as to the 1587 colony's whereabouts. This really seems to solve the problem and is logical. Matteo, according to John White's report, was with the colony when it arrived on July 22, 1587. Soon thereafter, he was declared Lord of Roanoke in a special ceremony. Expanding on Paramore's thoughts, Matteo, now appointed Lord of Roanoke, was apparently still among the colonists when John White departed for England. Soon after, Matteo probably returned to his people at Croatoan at about the same time the colonists departed Roanoke Island 4 points into the mainland. The CRO Croatoan engraving indicated that the Croatoan Indians had the information through Matteo. The information may, too, have been much more complex than could be engraved on a tree trunk or doorpost. By observing John White's and Thomas Harriot's 1585 Virginia Pars map, you also may notice that there are not a lot of place names to choose from, so therefore it would be a whole lot easier to tell the Croatoans, most particularly Matteo, where they were going. You also may notice in history that all mention of Matteo disappears at the same time. The 1585 Virginia Pars map is the one and only map that will serve us in any way as to what the colony of 1587 knew about the area. Prior to the Virginia Pars 1585, there were maps of the eastern coastline of North America, but seriously lacking in any detail that would be useful. Theodore de Brye's maps, of course, being published too late in 1590, suffer from their own problems and are of little use in explaining the track of Dorothie the Penance. Most of these maps are modified from the Virginia Pars as close-ups. Just like John White's last words as he departed Roanoke Island in 1590, the 1585 Virginia Pars is the last drawing of the area useful for navigation on the sounds and rivers by the colonists. The only other possibility would be a new map, constructed by the colonists themselves, with data accumulated as they traveled towards Chesapeake. The thought is entirely conjecture, but they could have used such a map to backtrack to Roanoke Island if necessary. How can we prove the accuracy of the 1585 Virginia Pars? By the following. Look at a satellite picture of the area. Now, March 26, 1586 Ralph Lane caught wind of a meeting going on at Choanoke on the Chowan River on the west bank near today's Harrisville. In their panots, Lane and his men departed Roanoke Island, sailed through the Albemarle Sound into the Chowan River, past Holiday Island, then stopping offshore, let down their ship's boats and went ashore, climbed the hill, and walked into the village of Choanoke. Lane took the chief Monadnock and his son SKYE as hostage. All of this from Lane's narrative. To make the point, Lane had to know where Choanoke was located. He most logically did this through John White's and Thomas Harriot's sketch map that he had with him at Roanoke at the time, and logically had a rough sketch of 1585 Virginia Pars in hand. The published version of 1585 Virginia Pars clearly shows Choanoke at the intersection of another waterway, the Wickacon River. If John White drew the map, I feel it was available for use by his colony. Just one of the few advantages the 1587 colony possessed. Just like John White's narrative about his last view of Roanoke Island as he departed in August of 1590, the Virginia Pars 1585 map is the absolute end of the line of any maps that were produced, that in a rough form that could be trusted by the 1587 colonist. Therefore, 1585 Virginia Pars is the one and only map that we can logically trust today. Any map beyond this map of 1585 would have to be pure conjecture in relation to the 1587 colony. I'm not saying the colonists ever saw the finished map, or that sketch maps of the area do not abound among the colonists. But as far as we know, and have available to us in this day and age, this is the only one that can help solve the mystery of the colony's disappearance. Matching up Ralph Lane's narrative and his visit to Choanoke and other points of interest, adding the observations of Amatus and Barlow, and observing the minute details of the 1585 Virginia Pars map, you get the feeling that the Chowan River route is the only logical route to take a ship the size of Dorothie the Panots and head off to Chesapeake Bay. Taking it step by step and observation by observation, we see first off that Croatoan is clearly marked on the map, but clearly in the opposite direction. By narrative, Lane indicates that the Pamlico Sound is full of flats and shoals and is broad, and he would not take his Panots there. A very dangerous situation for a ship. There would be many hours wasted trying to take a loaded ship to Croatoan. Plus, if they did run aground and become stuck, it would be more or less the end of the line for the colonists. Same thing goes for Currituck Sound. Lane indicates that today's Currituck Sound is very shallow and uses the words most dangerous in his narrative to describe it. White, in 1585 Virginia Pars, draws in the many shoals of Currituck Sound as well. Lane goes on to describe his route to Chesapeake through today's Albemarle Sound. Quote, broad sound, but all fresh water, and the channel of a great depth, navigable for good shipping, but out of the channel full of shoals. Lane, in his narrative of the surrounding waterways, is making the case in favor of the Albemarle Sound and the Chowan River. He goes on to describe the Roanoke River has so violent a current from the west and south, he says, that it made me almost to the opinion that with oars it would scarce be navigable. Lane describes the Chowan, whereas the river of Choanoke and all the other sounds and bays, salt and fresh, show no current in the world in calm weather, but are moved altogether by the wind. And this proves true, because it's that way today. There you have it, north, east, south, and west. Any way but the Chowan way, no rhyme intended, is dangerous and foolhardy. From the horse's mouths, Lane and White. Putting all of this in a modern-day perspective, if I have a large boat that drafts 4 feet of water, I cannot expect to continue in water that's only sometimes 4 feet deep. I must know that it's deep enough. Ralph Lane says that the Albemarle Sound is deep enough. How much more logical can you get? John White shows the Albemarle Sound on his 1585 Virginia Pars. John White, too, shows Choanoke on the map. Ralph Lane alludes to taking his Penance to Choanoke, which is up the Chowan River, doing so safely and returning. Logic says, and the map 1585 Virginia Pars says, and I do believe the colonists would agree among themselves this is the only acceptable route to take. So there they are, about 117 men, women, boys, and now 2 babies, stranded on Roanoke Island in 1587. The colony actually begins with a failure. They were supposed to establish the city of Raleigh on Chesapeake Bay, but due to the bad relations between John White and Simon Fernando, the colony is just over 100 miles south of that destination. It's late August. The temperature is still sweltering, and they may be hunkered down against hurricane conditions. And between them and Chesapeake Bay stands the Albemarle Sound, the Chowan River, and unbeknownst to them, the Great Dismal Swamp. One of the most important statements that came out of Ralph Lane's March 1586 interrogation of Monadnock at Choanoke on the Chowan River was Chief Monadnock's statement concerning a trek to Chesapeake Bay. To quote Monadnock, as per Ralph Lane, 3 days' journey in a canoe up his river of Choanoke, and then descending to the land, you're within 4 days' journey to pass overland northeast to a certain king's country, whose province lieth upon the sea. Apparently Monadnock is speaking of the southern shore of Chesapeake Bay. 2 things come to mind when Ralph Lane reacted with plans to this statement. There must be a known trail, and Monadnock was most happy to point him in that direction. It is a historical fact that America was covered with trails from one end to the other, and most, if not all, Native American tribes had direct contact with their nearest neighbors as a result. The trails are very similar to today's network of local roads and interstate highways, and are today remembered in many places by the highways we use today. According to scholars and historians and history itself, many of today's roadways were built over these prehistoric trails. According to one author, the late Dr. Paul A.W. Wallace, author of Indian Paths of Pennsylvania, the main characteristics of a Native American trail, he says, are dry, level, and direct. Even though we don't have to worry so much about the level aspect here in northeastern North Carolina, we must consider the dry and direct aspects. The level aspect refers mostly to trails located in mountainous areas. Through Dr. Wallace's research and observation, Native American trails were virtually the same all over the continents, and were born out of thousands of years of prior use by large animals, in our case, deer and bear. What this all leads up to in our research is now we know for a fact that Ralph Lane was told of a trail that led from the Chowan River overland to the Chesapeake Bay, or, as described, a large body of water to the north. Chief Monadnock and his son SKYE were being held hostage, one against the other, to extract this information, and we must agree that Monadnock's statement about the trail is true, as his son's head was riding on the line. I feel that Ralph Lane's narrative of his adventures from the summer of 1585 to the summer of 1586 obviously sets the stage for the 1587 colony. We're being plainly told in Lane's narratives as to what to expect, where things are, like villages, safe and dangerous water routes, food supplies, potential for growth and survival. We can only expect the 1587 John White colony would have an overwhelming interest in the information provided by Ralph Lane and Thomas Harriot. And one of the most important facts of all, as I've indicated before, at least John White was with Ralph Lane on many of the excursions, and if he was not actually in a party, he certainly would have no deeper than second-hand knowledge of what went on. 2. I feel that White would have passed all information on to his colony of 1587. The closeness of Lane and White and the accuracy of the intelligence gathered too can be assumed by the mere thought that these two men were at least on the same continent at the same time and during some of the situations at the very same second of a happening event between 1585 and 1586. In other words, John White knew what Ralph Lane knew. Not just the goodliest land parts, but also the worst thing that could happen to you today parts. When John White and company were told to get off the boat at Roanoke Island July 22nd, 1587, and not come back with any planters, you can feel John White's mind begin to burn with his dislike for Fernando. Studying John White's disposition at the time, you can very well see the wrong thing was said to John White. It's apparent that at the moment John White would not have returned to Fernando's ship, even if Fernando politely asked him to. Even on August 27th, 1587, when White was convinced to return to England, he came aboard the flyboat and not into the Lion where Fernando was, as you would expect, considering White's office as governor. You might remember that White came to the New World on board the Lion with Fernando, and the two men were in conflict at every turn. If the flyboats were not present, I'd say that John White would have remained on Roanoke Island come hell or high water, and numerous petitions would not have put the two back together again. Most likely, in the turmoil of the stranding, the first thing to hit John White's mind was the trip the previous year up the Chowan River and the thoughts of the overland trail, as indicated by Monadnock. Even though he nor any of his colonists had ever seen the trail, they believed that they could find it. This was John White's ace in the hole. A known good water route, Albemarle Sound to Chowan River to Chowanoke, then a trail to the Chesapeake Bay, further up the Chowan. This would accomplish Sir Walter Raleigh's directive to establish the city of Raleigh on Chesapeake Bay. Please note that Raleigh never directed anyone as to how they should arrive at the bay, through the mouth or otherwise. He was kind of leaving that up to Fernando, assuming that Fernando would enter the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. Well, it was John White's decision how to land, and a course of action had been established until Fernando threw a monkey wrench into the works. Here you see we have two pouting leaders at conflict with each other, White and Fernando, both too stubborn to compromise with the other. There's no indication from White's narrative that a compromise was even considered. It can be plainly seen that White could make a decision as well as Fernando, each locking into their own direction and holding on for dear life. Considering the three ships involved, the Lion, the flyboat, the Pinnace that we call Dorothie, there were probably 50 sailors involved total, with close to 100 not including the women planters involved. You can see that the planters probably could have mutinied and took all the ships if they wished, but White probably told them that he had a plan and to just be calm about it. I just can't see John White accepting without a fight a stranding of his colony on Roanoke Island. He was the type of man, indicated by his narratives, that would not do something without a back door, a redundancy to let him and his people escape. It had to be the trail. Not trying to be arrogant in my statements nor assumptive, I do feel that the colonists would make no other choice but to seek out this trail somewhere further up the Chowan River than any white man had been before. Think back to March 26, 1586, when Ralph Lane went ashore at Chowanoke, the largest village on the Chowan River. He held Monadnock, the king of the Chowan, and his son SKYE for information, one against the other. At that time, Monadnock revealed to Ralph Lane and company that there was a trail somewhere north on the Chowan River that would lead across land to a large body of water north of them, presumably the Chesapeake Bay. In recent years, Chowanoke has been explored by archaeologist David Phelps from East Carolina University. He describes Chowanoke as being over a mile long, stretched out between the Wickacon and Swain's Mill. It had a population of 2,000 in its heyday and was in existence for over 800 years. Well, it seems only appropriate that such a large village would have access to one or more trails, beaten down after centuries of animal and human travel, maybe even thousands of years. Keep in mind the requirements for a trail in this area: dry and direct. You can imagine a trail running along the high, dry side of the Chowan in Hertford and Bertie counties. In Hertford County, this trail later became known as the River Road and traveled between Cotton's Landing near Haresville to Winton. It becomes apparent this was the original trail, rather than today's Highway 45, which parallels this old route between the two towns. The River Road can trace its existence back to the early 1800s, when Hare's Mill was constructed along its route. Today, much of the River Road is still accessible with the exception of one chunk being cut out, which now belongs to and is occupied and secured by the Nucor Steel Complex. This River Road trail continues into Winton, then disappears into that community, re-emerging into what is Highway 158 West briefly. Then it abruptly turns north and crosses the Meherrin River at Parker's Ferry, then splits into two trails. According to historians, this location in the Meherrin, Parker's Ferry, was called a ford, where a trail crosses a waterway. The right-hand trail breaks to the northeast slightly, and the left-hand trail breaks slightly to the northwest. Of course, our trail of interest is the trail that breaks to the northeast. This is maybe the trail that Monadnock spoke of to Ralph Lane in 1586. However, looking at the Moseley map of 1733, our only reference to trails in northeastern North Carolina, we observe Little Somerton Creek turning off the head of the Chowan River. This creek then travels generally eastward until it intersects another trail. According to my friend, the late James Pierce, who was an avid canoeist and historian, it would take the average canoe the prescribed 3 days to arrive in the vicinity of Upper Somerton Creek. Once again, looking at the Moseley map of 1733, we see a road, or a trail if you wish, headed north. This may seem as if you're going around your elbow to get to your thumb. But also you must note that for the most part, the trail leading to the Parker's Ferry crossing, or the ford, is along a ridge, otherwise dry ground. The Gates County side of the river along the river is anything but dry. It's covered with swampland, which definitely disqualifies it altogether. At this intersection, Somerton Creek and the trail, you're about 50 miles from Chesapeake Bay. In David Beers Quinn's footnotes in the Roanoke Voyages, Quinn speculates with this question, and I quote, "Could this be the 50 miles inland that White speaks of?" Well, I say just possibly. This would answer the question of the 50 miles into the Main, which has perplexed historians and others for centuries. However, this does not answer the question of the missing 1587 colony, but again verifies the likelihood of the Chowan River being the chosen route of escape from Roanoke Island. To simplify matters, the colonists needed to be at Chesapeake Bay to establish the city of Raleigh. Conjecturally, they had a statement handed to them: 3 days upriver and 4 days overland will take you there, to Chesapeake Bay. Good idea. But the colonists never arrived because of a massive navigational error. Before we go any further into Chowan River country, in 2001, Tom C. Paramore published one of the most logical interpretations of John White's 50 miles into the Main statement that I've ever read. He takes the 1587 colony to Salmon Creek, which is just off the western Albemarle Sound, and settling in with a displaced portion of Wep-Emiyoc tribe of Native Americans. According to Paramore, the main body of the tribe lived in the Edenton area of Chowan County. When Monadnock's son SKYE was taken hostage and was being held at Roanoke Island, Monadnock issued a directive to UPCHURCH, one of the Monadnock's underlings and chief of the Wep-Emiyocs. He was ordered to pledge allegiance to Elizabeth, the Queen of England, and to Sir Walter Raleigh. To say the least, this brought division among the Wep-Emiyocs, with UPCHURCH and his loyal to the Queen group moving across Albemarle Sound to Salmon Creek as a result. This is well and good until the Mangokes which is the early name for the Tuscaroras, realized that the Wep-Emiyoks, now teamed up with the colonists, have moved into what they consider to be their territory. Paramore, like the rest of us, is not exactly sure as to the chronology of these events. The only item of record that we can pinpoint is SKYE being taken away to Roanoke Island. That date would have to be March 28, 1586. Somewhere beyond that date, and after Easter Day and before June 19, 1586, Monadnock gave his order to UPCHURCH to pledge his allegiance to Queen Elizabeth and to Sir Walter Raleigh. June 19th was Lane and Company's departure date with Drake's fleet. Now, Monadnock was hoping that by doing so, Lane would release his son. With the previous events having taken place, if they did, the 1587 colony is sitting at Salmon Creek, and Dorothie is moored probably just inside the creek's mouth, ready to take the colonists or a portion of these people to Chesapeake Bay, if they can find that trail upriver. Remember, they either have John White's map, 1585 Virginia Pars, or they have word of mouth handed to them personally by John White. The word being something akin to Monadnock's statement to Ralph Lane, 3 days up the Roanoke and 4 days overland, and you come out on a bay. Now, 2 other things to the advantage of the colonists. If they are at Salmon Creek, as supposed by Paramore, they now have befriended the sworn subject of the Queen of England, Chief UPCHURCH. UPCHURCH must be knowledgeable and wise, or he wouldn't be chief of the Wep-Emiyoks, now Bertie style. If Monadnock knew of the trail to Chesapeake and its particulars, then UPCHURCH must know as well. UPCHURCH easily could provide specific directions to the colonists as how to achieve it, and they probably would be overjoyed to see the colonists leave. Second advantage, Matteo could easily be with the colonists at Salmon Creek, and could have guided them there and had command of the language in use, Algonquin and English. This would have penetrated the language barrier. I'm sure that they must have encountered on many occasions. Other likelihoods that Matteo was aboard Dorothie. Matteo had recently been officially named Lord of the Roanoke on August the 11th, 1587. Secondly, it's implied or directly quoted from both Lane and White that Matteo was a participant in most noted events, from exploration up the Roanoke to raids on his own people accidentally. Perhaps Salmon Creek was a point at which the colonists would regroup themselves and then ready themselves for John White's return with supplies. White could have been, logically, back to the Roanoke Island area sometime in January, so that they could move on from that point. It is apparent throughout the history of the Roanoke voyages, there was always a period of scouting first by the English. Amadas and Barlow were sent first to briefly explore the area and report back before any large group of people and ships were committed. This trend continues with the explorations of the sounds and rivers and the overwinter outpost near Chesapeake Bay. There was first an establishment of a base of some sort, so that various exploration parties could backtrack to if they needed to. Groups would then pan out, then return to the temporary base, report, and then move on to the next probe into the likely livable and reachable areas. This procedure is verified by Ralph Lane's thoughts concerning the trail to the bay, as indicated by Monadnock. As Lane tells us, he would set up a base, or a scouts, then move about 20 miles or so and put up another scouts. Notice he was, as others of the Roanoke voyages, probing first, and then he would have an area or a scouts to backtrack to if it was necessary. Lane and others of the era apparently used this probe and then backup method over and over again. If this follows through, the stepping stone method of exploration would indicate that Salmon Creek was the first step of the probe towards Chesapeake Bay, rather than what is indicated in many speculations, which consist of loading up everything and moving all at once into the final settlement. The colonists were smart enough not to put all of their eggs into one basket. I can find nowhere in any of my research where a colonizing effort was not first preceded by a probe of some sort, similar today in our exploration of moon and space. The people of 1587 were so akin in their thinking. We always consider the feasibility first through theory, hypotheses, past experience, and then comes the probe. Considering the fact that Ralph Lane the year before sat down with Monadnock on that high bluff of the Chuan River near Harrisville and was told point blank there was a trail, we can only feel that the next step for the colonists would be to probe for this trail somewhere up the Chuan River. Now, everything beyond this point concerning movement of Dorothie, the ship's boats, and decisions and other humanistic thoughts and feelings are either directly my thoughts or are purely conjecture. Now, the locations and the lay of the land are pure facts. According to the navigational charts, it's 57.5 miles via the channel from Shallowbag Bay on Roanoke Island to the mouth of Salmon Creek via the channel markers, give or take 2.5 miles. To make the trip from Roanoke Island to Salmon Creek, I feel would be at least a 2 or 3 day process for the bulk of the 1587 colony in Dorothie, with at least a shore night somewhere in the vicinity of modern-day Columbia. Logically thinking, the process would be something like this. Several days before Dorothie, with the women on board, departs, 2 ships' boats with several days' supplies depart Roanoke Island just before first daylight. The ship's boats usually outfitted with 4 oars and a sail each, and 16 men would oar continuously using shifts. Along the way, water depth would be measured and noted as a route would be planned for the largest ship. Navigation along the Albemarle Sound would not be a problem, as they would never be out of sight of the shoreline. The 2 ships' boats would make about 20 to 25 miles the first day and would put ashore north of Newfoundland in Terrell County, provided a landing area was sighted. There they would camp for the night. Shortly before first light on day 2, several men from the 2 boats would be left as a rear guard for the 2 probing ships' boats. The 2 boats would either complete the remaining distance to Salmon Creek or once again hoe short before nightfall to establish a camp. If they did hoe short, possibly they camped in the vicinity of Mackey's in Washington County. Considering little travel was indicated after nightfall in any written accounts with the exception of being on the open ocean, I do believe that this probe of 2 boats held short in the Mackey's area. First spotting a landing area near the channel, then going ashore to set up a camp. This also would have to be done well before sunset, as the landing area would be almost impossible to locate due to the blinding setting sun at this time of the year just above the Washington County shoreline and the deep shadows that it would cause. On day 3, after depositing several more men in the Mackey's area, the 2 ships' boats would complete the soundings and remaining 20 miles or so to Salmon Creek, reconnoiter the area, and then set up camp. After studying the feasibility of landing Dorothie at Salmon Creek, taking day 4 to do so, the 2 ships' boats once again shove off on day 5. The men in boats backtrack, once again carefully noting the sights and the depths to Mackey's to pick up the men that were landed there. And then it was back to Newfoundland to recover the outposts there. And then the final trek back to Roanoke Island with a complete report on the feasibility of moving Dorothie to Salmon Creek. Likely during this same time, a 3rd ship's boat was launched to Croatoan, but not as a probe, but to set up an outpost at Croatoan to watch for John White's return, which was expected in mid-January of 1588. Being this would be a small outpost of only a few men, it would not put too much of an added pressure on the short food supply there. Possibly Matteo returned to his people with his outpost as well. These men would be ready to signal John White's expected flotilla with information concerning the movement of the colony. For them, it was a waiting game that probably eventually ran out of time when John White failed to show up. Maybe for this outpost it was the beginning of the many rumors concerning white ancestors among the Croatoan tribe, and as another example of the English way of dividing up their eggs out of the proverbial one basket. This, too, gives us reason to believe the CRO and Croatoan carvings at Roanoke Island were to indicate that information for whites awaited him there, as to the whereabouts of his colony. Maybe even Ananias Dare was a part of this outpost, and gives credence to the Dare name among the descendants of the Croatoans, as well as blue eyes, fair skin, and blond hair. In the first half of September 1587, with the probe to Salmon Creek and the outpost at Croatoan established, Dorothie and the three ships' boats are prepared to launch towards Salmon's Creek. About 112 people will have to be distributed among Dorothie and the three ships' boats. That is, if everyone has survived up to this point and not have died from a sickness that was noted by John White during his voyage back to England on the flyboat. Each ship's boat had a capacity of 20 souls, and Dorothie at least 40. We know this from the narrative of Ralph Lane, as he indicated there were 20 men in each ship's boat when they explored the Roanoke River. And John White tells us from his narrative upon arriving at Roanoke Island on July 22, 1587, that he and 40 of his best men went into the Penance for the trek to the island. With the three ships' boats in the lead and Dorothie trailing at a safe distance, the colonists leave Roanoke and carefully intercept the channel of the Albemarle Sound. With all their sails run out, as well as the sails of the ship's boats, perhaps the entourage is making 2 to 4 miles per hour. It doesn't seem like a great speed, but should put the ship's boats and Dorothie within the vicinity of Salmon's Creek in 2 days. The ship's boats would be well ahead of Dorothie, almost out of sight. If the lead ship's boat had encountered an obstacle, then they would have to relay back to Dorothie to stop. As you can imagine, stopping a sailing ship in close quarters of the channel could be no easy task. Even though the route would have previously been tested in the probe, water levels in the Albemarle Sound are dependent on the winds in the area and can change rapidly because of it. You must keep in mind that loss of the Penance due to grounding would mean the loss of a major vehicle for 40-some people, plus what food stores that they may have had on board. On this first day of the travel, and assuming everything went as planned, as nightfall approached, Dorothie would remain in the channel and drop her anchor. The three ships' boats would return to her, drop their anchors, or tie up alongside. Perhaps 1 or 2 of the ship's boats would head to shore in the vicinity of today's Columbia to seek food or to just reconnoiter the area for its resources. Otherwise, it would just be a long wait for the sun to rise the next morning. There must have been a conversation among the colonists and those responsible for sailing the ship as to what awaited them at Salmon Creek. According to Tom Paramore, as previously mentioned, a faction of the Wep-Emiyoc Indians possibly relocated there from the Edenton area due to friction among the tribal members when an allegiance was made to Queen Elizabeth and Sir Walter Raleigh. This allegiance was commended by Monadnock in hopes that doing so would cause his son SKYE to be released by Ralph Lane and his force the year before. Personally, I have a big problem with that. If SKYE was returned by Ralph Lane's 3 men in June of 1586, and all the bothersome white men were observed to be gone from Roanoke Island, I can see no further division among the Wep-Emiyoc tribe, and no further need to live separated by the Albemarle Sound. Furthermore, to think the Chornoks and the Wep-Emiocs would really hold a pledge to 2 unseen and unimaginable characters such as the Queen and Sir Walter Raleigh is absurd. On a clear night, when the sun sets on the Albemarle Sound, without a breath of wind, the surface of the water becomes ripple-free and mirror-like. Without a moon in the sky, stars become brilliant points of light and reflect in the water like a continuance of the sky, till you feel you're surrounded by a bubble of stars. Perhaps the mothers nursed the babies, and the others ate and drank from their meager supplies. From this point on, acquiring good drinking water was no longer a problem on the Albemarle Sound, as it was all of fresh water, to quote Ralph Lane. Along the Albemarle shoreline are many deer, rabbits, raccoon, possum, wild geese, ducks, and the migrating tundra swans that would be arriving in the area as it is today in mid-September. The sounds the colonists would hear would be millions of frogs, crickets, and the honking of the geese and the quacking of the ducks. Occasionally, they could hear a large flock of geese flapping their wings and churning the water in a sort of false takeoff, which is quite eerie to hear in the dark. Without wind, the heat of the day lingers well into the night, especially if you're in a boat, as the water is an easy 80 degrees around you, and the humidity makes you sweat as if you were standing in the sun. If Dorothie is anchored in the midst of the channel, which she would most likely be, mosquitoes and other flying insects would not be a problem. The channel is broad, and it's bordered on both the north and the south by at least a mile of water, covering the many shallows and shoals. Maybe this was the intention, anyway, to stay away from the aggravating mosquitoes, rather than mooring closer to the shoreline. At this point in our narrative, the sun would rise to the stern of the ship as she was facing west. The distant shore of the western edge of the Albemarle could be seen as a very narrow line across the horizon, and about the center of this line would be Salmon Creek. If the wind came up with the sun, the sails would be raised to catch it and propel Dorothie along. If the wind did not rise, then 2 tow lines would be attached to the pennants by 2 ships' boats, while the 3rd ship's boat would lead the way again to detect any problems that may lie ahead. The 2 towing boats would only do this if the ship was becalmed, rather than remaining anchored and wasting the day. But usually, as it is today, a shortage of wind, as on the Outer Banks, is not a problem. As Dorothie, our pennant, makes its way towards Salmon Creek, the various observers on board would probably notice an increase in the color of the water, a brownness resulting from the washdown coming from the swiftly flowing Roanoke River, which before damming of the river at Roanoke Rapids emitted great floods down its course. Water would also flow from the other 2 sisters, the Middle and the SKYE. Various debris would be noticed floating by in the water, from the entire uprooted trees to broken limbs and green leaves in the water, noting the recent encounter with heavy winds and a deluge of rain from hurricane conditions. If a hurricane had raked the area days before the departure from Roanoke Island and followed its normal course for this area of the state, the days following would be brilliantly clear blue skies with a steady flow of wind, mostly from the northwest, low humidity, an increase in the depth of water in the Albemarle, and a decrease in the depth of the water in the Chowan as the water is pushed downstream. To quote Ralph Lane, there being no current in the Chowan at all, but only controlled by the wind. As the 3 ships' boats approached Salmon Creek, they would begin tacking as they headed nearly straight into the wind. Dorothie would have to do the same to make headway, which would be dangerous for the larger ship, especially after a large weather event, which could have mound up new shoals. As the crew of Dorothie takes sight of the Salmon Creek Inlet, they observe to the right the main Wepemioc village at today's Edenton Bay. Even though Paramore indicates that Salmon Creek would be a likely place for the colonists to land and have an assumptive relationship with a remnant faction of the Wepemiocs, this can only be conjectural, since there is no historic record of such a physical division of the Wepemiocs taking place. Even if such a division was noted in history, and the Wepemioc then actually moved a faction to Salmon Creek, then how would John White know of this to recommend it to his colony? Remember, John White arrived with the colonists on the same boat at the same time, and was just as surprised by Simon Fernando's orders to get off the boat as anyone. Not only that fact stands, but when Ralph Lane departed Roanoke Island the year before, John White was with him. If anything is logical, the colonists would take up with the Wepemiots at Edenton rather than Salmon Creek. Another thing to keep in mind. The Mangokes were in control of the Salmon Creek area and did not tolerate anyone being in their territory, even if they were Wepemiots. Furthermore, considering all the bad relations with the Native Americans left by Ralph Lane and company the year before, thinking the colonists would associate themselves or want to associate with any Native American tribe is hard to believe. Otherwise, the colonists would have remained on Roanoke Island with the Roanoke Indians. Remember, the reason for the entire trip to the New World was to establish the city of Raleigh on Chesapeake Bay. I can't see cutting this idea short just for a 100-mile trek to completion of the idea. After all, they had traveled thousands of miles already. As noted, if a hurricane had just passed over the area, the rivers intersecting the Albemarle Sound would have been swollen to the banks with the runoff. Not an inviting sight or thought, wondering when it would settle. Possibly the colonists were greeted by canoes from the Mangokes or the Wepemiots, warning them not to come ashore under the threat of attack. Remember, these are not long-lost friends, but for the Native Americans, it was more like discovering that your dog now has fleas again. It's my opinion, as the colonists would approach the Salmon Creek area, they would veer away and instead penetrate the Chowan River, as there was no reason to hesitate or mingle themselves among the Native Americans. Now, how do we connect all this up? Dorothie, the colonists, the Chowan River, and the Chesapeake Bay.